Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, it's actually a group interview where I am interviewing Rafi Santo and Sara Vogel, who are two of the three scholars that wrote the paper that I unpacked in last week's episode titled CS for What? Diverse Visions of Computer Science Education in Practice. In this interview, we discuss informal learning within CS education, the CS Visions framework, social justice pedagogies and equity, considerations for integration, and much more. If you haven't listened to last week's episode, I highly recommend doing that, as it will provide some context for our discussion on the CS Visions framework. And then once you've done that, come back here and listen to this awesome interview with Rafi and Sara. There are a lot of scholars in publication that both Rafi and Sara mentioned throughout this podcast, so make sure you check out the show notes, which you can find in the description using that link or by visiting jaredoleary.com, and none of the links are affiliate links, nothing like that. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will begin now with an introduction by Sara and Rafi.
My name is Sara Vogel. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Graduate Center, which is at the City University of New York, in what is hopefully my last year in the program working on my dissertation. And I'm also a research assistant with an NSF-funded project called Participating in Literacies in Computer Science, which focuses on how bilingual young people use language resources in computer science education.
My name is Rafi Santo. I'm a learning scientist. I focus largely on the intersection of digital culture, learning, and institutional change in education. And I hold a position as a research associate at CSforALL, and I'm also the principal researcher at Telos Learning.
So tell me the story of what led to your interest in computer science education research.
Starting at a young age, I was always kind of a tinkery kid who enjoyed making little websites and using technology. And later on, when I became a teacher, I was a bilingual teacher in the New York City public school system for a while. I was always the most excited to watch students use technology to amplify their voices. So I did projects with them where they would blog or tell stories with technology in videos. I found this amazing organization, which Rafi was also a part of for many years, called Global Kids. There's a program within Global Kids where students use digital media to express themselves. And so working at that organization, they were doing a lot of game design work at the time when I was there. And it wasn't just about making videos and using tech to make, it was about building tech. So I sort of hooked onto this idea of CS education as also a means of student self-expression. And I was placed at this school called New Directions in the Bronx, which worked with quite vulnerable populations of students. And they were also bilingual kids, and watching them use technology in such innovative ways and integrating their communities and languages, it was really exciting. And as the CS4All movement kind of took off in New York City, I thought about, where are students like this in that movement? Are people paying attention to the unique strengths and challenges facing what we call emergent bilingual students? So that's what sort of set me on the path to explore these questions as a researcher.
Yeah, and like Sara, we've got so many parallels. We're both New York City kids. We're kind of little tinkerers in our earlier years, and maybe early interest in technology, and then both even worked in the same organization at Global Kids, even in the same program in the online leadership work. And I'm a kid of the 90s and the early web, and was always somebody who was kind of taking apart my computers and doing kind of that early work in web design as things like GeoCities and other kind of similar platforms came up, and really kind of grew up in a time when the web was very much more, I would say, tinkerable than it is more today. And then within games, in gaming culture, I was never a huge gamer, but I always was involved and always really interested in the kind of modifications and customization that you can do, and just really found that technology was a place where I had a lot of agency and creativity personally as a kid. And early in my kind of professional career, saw the tools as very powerful modes of expression and reflection for me. I did a lot of blogging when I was in college, and then through into my early years, my 20s, my professional life. And I just loved being in conversation through technology with a broader world. And it really did kind of expand horizons of who I was in dialogue with, and also what kinds of ideas I was exposed to. Like Sara said, my early work was really around the relationship between an emerging digital culture and digital tools and youth power and voice. I had a really wonderful experience with global kids of really coming to see and understand how new media could be a venue for young people to both explore their interests, but also explore their power. Global Kids is an organization dedicated to having kids think about both local issues and global issues. And within the online leadership program there and digital learning program there, how to use technology to amplify and expand their voice. And so we were always innovating around new media that was coming out, virtual worlds like Second Life, platforms around game design, practices of game design, programming and tinkering in environments like Scratch. We were always just at the edge of trying to be like, well, what's happening in kind of the digital culture space more broadly, and how can it be applied to our goals of organizing youth power and having them really be actors that are participating in their communities in ways that are consequential. And then, I've got broader work that really came out of that related to, doing curriculum design around technology, and whether it's game design, digital storytelling, programming that I did in my early grad career, and then a lot of work, building off of that in informal digital learning in the out of school space in New York, really rooted in kind of community-based organizations. And that was sort of the line in, again, as Sara mentioned, to when the CS4All movement kicked off, certainly locally here in New York, where we're both based, seeing so many of the ideas I've been working on for many years at that point, finding a pretty prominent place in a big policy movement.
Yeah, it's interesting going to the various education conferences, how there's an interest in game-based learning, but not a lot of people necessarily know about game design in relation to game-based learning. So I was at a conference last week at the time of this recording where they were talking about game-based learning in STEM classes and whatnot, and they're like, oh, well, you should hire developers to create these games and yada, yada. And I was like, okay, that's cool and all, but hey, how about you actually collaborate with a computer science educator and have kids design games for other kids, and what could you do with that? And
yeah,
it's just funny that there are people in the school that can help you with that thing and help you develop those games, but instead people are looking outside of it rather than actually collaborating with it, their own teachers in their school.
Yeah, and I think a really powerful, part of my journey, and especially as a learning scientist, was coming to ideas of what really powerful learning is. Right? What is powerful learning? I know when I was at Global Kids, and probably when Sara was there too, we're really heavily influenced by the work of the kind of constructionist learning movement, really foundationally led by Seymour Papert, and then his contemporaries and Mitch Resnick and Yasmin Kafai, Edith Harel, who really just saw the power that comes of making things, creating things, digital artifacts, non-digital artifacts, in community, in social context, and things that are personally relevant to you. And I think, to me, one of the reasons that I was never really oriented towards technology for technology's sake, but really interested as a burgeoning learning scientist at the time in what does powerful learning look like? And I saw in the kind of creative and constructionist orientations that can be found in learning in computer science, really a powerful mode of engaging with the world and engaging in learning.
So could you paint a vignette of, or a story that kind of impacts you today that is an example of what powerful learning looks like?
I can definitely kind of piggyback on what Rafi was saying about Global Kids. Just for the sake of picking one, Global Kids had this project developed by a lot of people. I'm going to miss people when I say it, but people like Barry Joseph and Juan Rubio and Jack Martin from who's now at the libraries, Joe Luis Cedeno, all these great people who came together to think about history and how to have students explore the history of their neighborhood using the tools of game design, and specifically location-based game design. So this is a really niche genre, now exploded with things like Pokemon Go, but at the time, few people were thinking about games in public spaces and having them really support students in exploring local issues and histories. I got to run this project, which is called New York City Haunt, because the idea is that you're excavating the ghosts that haunt all around New York City, several locations, including the school that I mentioned before, which was called New Directions. This is a school that students, it was like a transfer middle school, so it was students who, for one reason or another, their previous middle schools sloughed them off, which is a really sad state of affairs in New York City that this even happens. But there are schools that New Directions would just accept all the students that other middle schools didn't know how to deal with. The students were extremely intelligent and capable and interesting. And I got to do this project, New York City Haunts, with them, and it's sort of an intergenerational experience because we had middle school students who were often of varying ages because it was an overage, undercredited kind of situation. We also had their younger brothers and sisters who just decided to come along for the summer. We had high school aged interns from Global Kids, and we had college aged interns and adult facilitators. And so it was this incredible opportunity to engage in like an intergenerational, collaborative, place-based game design. When do you ever get to do that? Like, this is like the motherload as an educator of just an awesome situation. So we'd have like the 9-year-old inspiring the 18-year-old to like, you know, pick their head up off the table and get creative. And you'd have the 18-year-old talking about, you know, hip hop with the 9-year-old. And they created this incredible game that takes place in the neighborhood in the Bronx about rebuilding after sort of the arsons that occurred in the South Bronx that we know are sort of part of the history of the South Bronx, the disinvestment and of that area, and students thinking about what are the items that would be needed for a group of concerned citizens to repair and rebuild their neighborhoods. And so it's just this opportunity to do this culturally sustaining, like technology-rich, intergenerational project. And I just like thank the stars that I got to see that and got to participate in that before going into education research, where so many buzzwords about culturally sustaining pedagogy are being thrown around. And to really know what that means and what it looks like or what it can look like was really exciting.
Yeah, I love projects that allow kids to collaborate outside of their age band, because like most grade levels, you're in a class with kids who are like plus or minus maybe 1 year age difference from you. And to have like a second grader collaborate with a high schooler or even just like comment on stuff, it's awesome.
Yeah. And I think the example that comes to mind is in some ways really similar, but has some interesting contrasts. It was also in my time at Global Kids, which I think is a very special place, so we can kind of acknowledge that. You know, I had mentioned that we were doing some work in Second Life, which folks might not be familiar with, but it was an early platform that was kind of a 3D virtual world. It wasn't a game. It was very creativity oriented. So you can create, you know, if you kind of think about Minecraft now, where you're, you know, the sandbox version of Minecraft where you can kind of build anything. Second Life was sort of like that, but it had its own coding language. You can, you know, customize your avatars to, you know, nth degree, you know, doing graphic design, porting it into the system and doing scripts that really allowed you to kind of like make games or little small interesting interactions and toys. But you can kind of really use your imagination really broadly. And we did work in Second Life, and we ran some programs there where we had kids that we never met. One summer we had a program where we had kids in the US, Canada, Australia, and Russia, actually. They were all in a program together. We'd meet online in this virtual world on this kind of crazy island with a volcano that we had. And, you know, a big part of that program was, like many programs at Global Kids, having kids decide on issues they cared about and figure out how to run some kind of campaign. Except in this case, it wasn't in the quote unquote real world, it was in this virtual space. And after like a number of weeks of this kind of camp that we had online, the kids, they're all teenagers, decided to do a big campaign around child sex trafficking. Of course, the kids always choose these incredibly intense issues.
Yeah.
We did not choose that issue. Reliably, kids didn't choose these issues. And they created just this incredible installation on the island, worked together with our help. It really was an adult youth collaboration. I think, again, this theme of like what it looks like not to have, you know, young people working individually on even on their own project, but on something very large, something very ambitious, and something that requires them to collaborate with adults and maybe with, you know, youth younger than them. Everyone had different roles. Some kids were good at programming, some kids were good at the graphic design side, some kids were great project managers. And they created this amazing, it was actually a maze. And as you went through the maze, there was all these kind of knowledge building experiences that the player would go through about child sex trafficking. They created a donation system as well that you can embed in Second Life, where kids at the end of the maze could donate to end child sex trafficking, an important NGO that does leading work in that. And it was this amazing experience of, first of all, like, you know, staying up so many nights together online and kind of geeking out together, but also really of the sense of accomplishment together of how you can use creativity and technology to advance ideas of justice. In this case, it was in a local community. It just was in a virtual local community. There was probably about, you know, 2,000 kids on Team Second Life, and I think most of them went through the maze at the end of it, even though we had just maybe a dozen and a half kids that worked on the project. So that really stuck with me as something that was like, okay, this is really at the sweet spot of stuff that kids care about, stuff related to justice, stuff that really advances their ability to be agentic in the world, has hard skills, has soft skills, really all of the stuff is together, and really reflects more how you work in the real world in collaboration and on large projects, right? As opposed to what you usually see in more traditional environments. So there are good exceptions to that even in schools.
So did this occur in a formalized educational environment like a school or outside of it?
I mean, in the example I gave, it was entirely online and kids getting together literally in the virtual world. Yeah.
My example, the camp, it was a summer camp, took place at a school, but it used the school space in a completely different way than you normally see schools being used, where students were looking at those old plaques on the walls of the school that tell you who the honor roll was in 1950, right? So they were using their school as sort of an artifact of history to excavate, themes and people. And so, yes, it took place in a school, but not within the formal strictures of what school looks like.
Yeah, because I'm interested, the roles that were mentioned, kids like being a project manager, being the coder and whatnot. Oftentimes in schools, it's like, well, you have to sample all of the roles and do a little bit at all of them rather than specialize in one area. And I personally find value in cultivating individualized expertise. So I'm wondering if you were to kind of do some of this stuff in a classroom where there are like sets of standards or expectations of everybody coming out falsely as being or knowing the same thing, what might you do or navigate, or how might you like speak to an administrator with those kinds of expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I can say from actually studying other organizations, I'm thinking in particular of one organization I've studied. It's a youth media organization, youth filmmaking organization in Chicago called Free Spirit Media. They focus on youth kind of making both documentary as well as kind of PSA films and narrative or reporting. What they do in a couple of their programs that I studied is that they'll have every kid cycle through in the first semester every role involved in the production team. So whether it's being the overall project manager, being the cinematographer, doing editing, doing pre-production, everyone has to cycle through all of those roles. And then in the second semester, they choose to specialize and go deep in one of them. And so I think that there is a lot of value, both from an empathy standpoint, to have to cycle through all those roles, as well as from a skills and outcome standpoint, so that everyone kind of does get a taste of everything. And then the kind of agency that can come from going very, very deep. And I think that's very applicable to things like game design or app development or other forms of project-based CS work.
Yeah. And then the way I've handled this in terms of work in schools, because I have run Global Kids programming like as a class when we would do community school partnerships, navigating those is always tricky and challenging. Students also have very different expectations of what happens in a school day versus what happens outside of school.
Right.
One way that we did that was we would have sort of mini challenges where kids could sort of see a project through or see small projects through and complete many roles, and then a sort of deeper project where then they would kind of specialize. So everyone would get a chance to see what it was like to use the software that we used for the coding of the location-based game design was Tailblazer. So they could see how to code in Tailblazer, how to draw some artwork, how to write a little story, and then afterwards pick what they wanted. So very similar to what Rafi's saying, where you get a taste of everything, so you get that real deep, rich exposure, and then you can go deep on what you care about and what you like to do and build your identity that way.
Yeah, I did that with programming languages in the classes I facilitated. So like we'd spend some time in Scratch, then in Sonic Pi using Ruby, and then doing Swift, and then doing JavaScript. And then after that, it was, all right, pick whatever you want, whatever's more in alignment with what you're interested in exploring. And then they could dive deep into that thing. And then they'd often kind of jump between the languages and whatnot. So what was something that you believed when you first began working in education that you no longer believe?
So I got into education in 2009, which was the capital R reform movement, right? Like was at its fever pitch. And you had also that coinciding with the austerity budgets of the financial crisis. It was like a time of intense pressure on schools, on teachers, on students, all of this kind of in the guise of accountability in some ways. Also in the air was this idea of the achievement gap. And how the role of teachers was to close this achievement gap. And there was this educational research supporting this view that a good teacher was the single greatest predictor of student achievement. And student achievement was measurable by a state exam. And the rhetoric trickled down to me as a sort of first year, like wide-eyed teacher as, oh, if students aren't doing well, then you are to blame. Like teachers are the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that now, having had a lot more experience in non-traditional education spaces, both here and abroad, I was able to work in Mexico and Argentina and see like different approaches to education and education reform, collectivist and movement-based education approaches. I can now kind of question all of those assumptions, and those assumptions are still with us, but I think that 2009, 10, 2008 was real height in a lot of this rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And now I can kind of question this idea that there's only one way that students can do well and achieve. And now you see that I actually see, that's a quite racist and classist premise, given that in that model of the achievement gap, achievement is always this, the performance of a white, standard, English-speaking, middle-class person, right, was kind of the benchmark. And then everyone else has to sort of measure up to that. And that is a racist classist premise around this gap kind of rhetoric. And then also the second one being like, teachers can make a big difference, but they can only be as effective as those support systems around them. And teachers are embedded in these, larger systems and forces in education and also outside of it. And then also the third one was you have to be critical of education research because, these oftentimes quantitative studies that take aggregated data across districts and student populations, you can't apply that to individual schools and classrooms or experiences. And so I think it's sort of imbued in me a healthy skepticism of these ideas about reform.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just so glad that rhetoric has also shifted since then about what priorities in education should be to some extent.
I think there's maybe two big things that come to mind for me in terms of learning. And one is, I would just say as a preface, I find it very satisfying to find myself wrong or to change my views as I learn more. I think that's one of the most gratifying things about being a professional that's dedicated to thinking deeply about education is that we come in and we think our best thoughts, or we have our strongest commitments, and then if we have a stance towards learning, we need to be willing and able to shift what we think we know, which really again is kind of doubling down on learning, right? It's deciding we're going to be a learner. So for me, I think the one was my belief through the way I came into education, my experiences both as a child in a formal education system and then as an early professional in more informal learning environments, was that an idea that really the only places we could have very powerful learning are in informal learning environments. This is a view that I very strongly held, I would say probably in the first decade of my career, starting working first as a classroom tutor in formal classroom environments and seeing really practices that I did not find inspiring from a learning perspective. And then my experience in school itself, which was in general, I found very uninspiring for the most part. I was very disengaged by the kind of curricula and teaching, with some small exceptions, that I experienced. And then going and working in informal environments, starting in museums and then moving into after school programs, virtual and online programs, and really, really creative stuff. I just really came to believe that like the only powerful learning could be in informal settings that was interest driven and collaboratively done. And those principles of like interest driven and collaboratively done, all of that, those haven't changed, but I've actually started to see a lot more within the school system, within the formal education system, just really incredible, not just teachers, but schools that have supported this work. There's really great research by Jal Mehta of Harvard and Sarah Fine, a book called In Search of Deeper Learning, The Quest to Remake the American High School, that really documents a lot of the kinds of things that we talk about in the best informal and out of school programs, how they have come in certain places in high schools. And I think that's been a big shift for me and made me much more excited to work with formal schooling settings, and now doing so much work with districts around CS. I'm bringing that belief that this kind of powerful learning can happen in schools. I would say that the second big shift in my thinking about education, and that really came out of the work that Sarah, Dixie, and I did on the CS Visions work, which we'll get into, was the idea that education and learning is really only about the young person. And obviously, like, our deep commitments to young people, to their interests, to their power, to their learning, to their desires and aspirations for their future are obviously a huge, huge, huge part, and that we don't listen to that enough. And I've really come to think more deeply about how do we think about education as a public good? And if it's a public good, it's not only about the young person themselves or an individual young person, but about a society and about how a society is structured, about who gets what, and what a society kind of needs to advance. So even if something is maybe not of interest to a young person, it might be something that is really critical for all of us, that young person has it. For me, my deep, deep commitment to civic education, to democratic participation as one of the key roles of education. Not every kid really is super interested in thinking about, whether it's civic issues or political issues or even local community issues. Like, you can't assume that every kid is, but there is a need and a responsibility that we have collectively as a society to ensure that every young person, and we have so much work to do on this, but to ensure that every young person comes out of their schooling in K-12 and further in higher education with an orientation towards being a citizen. And that's not just about them, it's about all of us. And so that shift of really understanding that education is not just about the individual, but really is about society has been a shift in my thinking that is important. And it might seem obvious in retrospect, but we all come from our places and all have our own learning journeys, and that was part of mine.
So you mentioned the CS Visions framework, and so last week's episode that airs right before this, I kind of unpack what the framework is and kind of talk about how I was considering the different visions within the work that I've created. But I'm wondering, what is like the elevator speech that you might give for the CS Visions framework?
So I can give it a shot. I've never tried it out on an elevator, but we can see the CS Visions framework, which was developed by Rafi Santo, myself, and Dixie Ching, who could not join us on this podcast, but is a wonderful collaborator. So the CS Visions framework helps people see the values underlying rationale for CS education and those impacts that they hope it has for students, communities, in the world. Once stakeholders have a sense for those underlying values, we believe they can more coherently plan for programmatic and instructional designs and implementations. So the framework that we developed charts out what are various different underlying values and impacts that CS education can have, and how do those values potentially look like in practice? How do they drive practice? And then going back to what Rafi was saying about education as a public good, we believe sort of that by exposing people to this range of values that can drive CS education, we hope to demonstrate that pluralism in CS education is sort of a good in and of itself. Just like there's no one way to educate, there's no one way to do CS education. That's sort of it in a nutshell. We have both a paper that was developed for SIGSE, which is the Computer Science Education Conference in 2017, which sort of outlines those 7 values and impact areas that you talked about on your podcast last week. And then we also have the more practitioner-friendly resource that makes those links to practice.
And the way that I think about it always, and really the question that we started with, is CS for what? Mm-hmm. Like, the CS Visions framework is a tool that helps really anybody more thoughtfully and deliberately answer the question, CS for what? And we have a very firm belief that, especially in the context of a very robust policy movement that is there, state leaders, federal leaders, even district leaders are very much pushing ahead on this. And we think that there can be a danger for rushing too quickly. We know this in general in education, that rapid reforms and rushes to change rarely work well. Even taking out questions of efficacy, a rush to implementation having impacts on efficacy and quality, we're mostly concerned in this work with impacts on actually what's being accomplished. Like, if you rush to implementation and you don't think about what ultimate purpose you're wanting to have CS education in place, mm-hmm. you're probably accomplishing somebody else's goals, right? And we think of that as a problem. We want communities, educators, even tool makers, designers, curriculum designers, to really be thinking critically about, like, whose interests are being served by this? Are we serving the interests that we believe in, or are by not reflecting and asking ourselves the question, CS for are we serving some other kind of interest? And then there are a lot of other impacts on quality, which Sara alluded to in this idea of coherence, right? If you don't have a really strong North Star, not to say that it has to be set and always stay the same, it can evolve, but if you don't have a strong North Star, how are you going to align as a district? How are you going to align your curriculum, your professional development, your course offerings, your credit requirements, your supports for students? How do you have all that aligned if you don't have a North Star around what the ultimate purposes are? If that's not in place, you'll end up with kind of a spaghetti mess, and you won't reach any outcomes well. You'll just you might have conflicting policies in place, conflicting supports in place. I think we should name some of it as we talk about this, right? A vision that's about creativity has different implications than a vision that's about economic mobility and workforce development. A vision that's about closing representation gaps has different implications than a vision that's about promoting systems thinking, as an example, which is something that can be associated with different types of CS education. And you really want to think, well, if this is for jobs, if it's for justice, if it's for innovation, each of those has implications for how you design your curriculum. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there might involve trade-offs, or there might also involve sequencing, right? We can say that, hey, we're oriented towards creativity in a really central way for all of our students. We want computing to be an avenue for creativity. We do have some curriculum early on that has some puzzle-based stuff that has a predetermined answer, but that's in a sequence of courses and learning opportunities that eventually create the possibility of maybe using much more open-ended platforms, say like Python or processing, that support creativity in various ways.
And I'll also add that Rafi mentioned a couple times this sense of we. Is our CS education showing our values? Is it reflecting the values that we care about? Well, who is this we? Mm-hmm. Is something that we've had to wrestle with as well, because if it's just the same voices that are always at the table in policy-making conversations, then your CS education might continue to serve narrow interests in conjunction with thinking about values-based planning for CS Ed. In order for it to work, you have to have a really broad sense of who the we is and engage in what could be fairly messy deliberative processes with lots of voices, especially those that aren't often at the table, like families. Mm-hmm. If you have immigrant families in your communities, making sure that your outreach is available in different languages, thinking about students with disabilities, thinking about teachers at various levels. These are all the voices that have to be at the table so that you can really capture what your community believes CS education is for.
Yeah, and really the underlying value that we have behind this work, and it might sound, kind of highfalutin, but it really is democracy, mm-hmm. right? We, I think, believe deeply in the idea of education as a public good, and B, a democratically oriented public good, right? That it must be something where it is collectively determined what shape this public good takes, because it is about all of us. And the idea of having deliberative tools and processes, whether it's about CS education or not, to us is very powerful. It's about really realizing these democratic ideals of education.
Yeah, one of the things that really kind of was eye-opening for me is anecdotally speaking, much of the discourse that I've noticed tends to revolve around economic and workforce development. And I love that you're like, well, there's all these other areas that you can kind of align to or have impacts on and whatnot. And I think this is a great way of framing it, because if a district or a teacher or school or whatever is starting CS education and all they hear is people talking about jobs, workforce development, and then they see this and go, oh, but wait, there's actually more options for us rather than going down this very narrow pipeline that's geared towards one set of interests or impacts. So I really like the way that it was framed, and here are a bunch of different programs, and here's how they kind of combine multiple things together and synthesize 2 or 3 of these into something that works really well for the communities that they're working with.
Yeah, and jobs is an important outcome for sure, mm-hmm. of education, but why should we be adding an entirely new discipline into our school systems purely so that a small subset of that population of those school going kids eventually enters that discipline or that sector. We don't teach English and English language arts so that everyone can become a novelist or a writer. We do it because it's a core mode of communication in society. We don't teach science so that everyone becomes a scientist. We do it because a citizen in society needs to be scientifically literate, and there's a mode of thinking and epistemology. And similarly, if we think about computer science as being something that we believe every kid should have, it's not so that they should all be entering these tech jobs or CS jobs, but so that they can operate in the world more broadly. What's a good reason to actually have CSB for everyone? We don't think that jobs is a sufficient reason to have a for all. At least I don't.
Yeah. And that was sort of, you'd asked us before, like what inspired us to create this framework. That I think really was a core motivation. We were watching the media, we were watching the news as mayors and governors and senators talked about CSforALL as President Obama announced it at the State of the Union at the time. And we thought to ourselves about our experiences as educators in New York City's vibrant digital media spaces and thought we have to amplify this conversation. So that was sort of a core motivation. I'd written a course paper on it in my very first year as a doctoral student. Rafi and Dixie read it and were like, we're on board. We want to work on this with you. And so that sort of led us to generate the framework. But the framework was not just the three of us. And that's something to really put a point on. It was developed through what Rafi and Dixie and their collaborators call the participatory knowledge building session. So we brought folks together from organizations in New York City that did digital media and CS work with kids, tool designers, policymakers at the New York City Department of Education, formal and informal educators. And we asked them that question that Rafi asked before of CS for what? Why should we teach CS to all kids? They gave us tons of different reasons that came from lots of different backgrounds and standpoints. And then we sort of synthesized them through the framework and did member checking at various moments through the process to make sure it was really speaking to community members. The framework was a labor of love of many, many people.
So before we started recording, you mentioned, and even just recently, that you started working on this a while ago, this framework, and then it's now kind of housed within CSforALL. So I'm wondering, how does this framework fit into the mission of CSforALL?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that I think is really important to say is that CSforALL and its previous incarnation of CSNYC, the Foundation for Computer Science Education in New York City, has always been a huge, huge supporter of this work. Early in the development of the framework, folks from CSNYC/CSforALL were participants. They helped develop it, but they always saw, and really I'll highlight especially Leanne DeLyser, the founder and current executive director, and other co-founder in the form of Michael Preston, always really saw the value of this work. And I think it came in at an important time in CSforALL's development as an organization, when it was really formally cohering around its strategy of supporting local change at the district level, which is really something that's very distinct within the CS Ed field. A lot of the field is full of really amazing professional development providers and curriculum providers and tool makers. But there was really, I think CSforALL really saw it, there was a huge need for districts as organizations to think about how they wanted to equitably, sustainably, and rigorously enact computer science education. And there was nobody else doing that. So CSforALL really went deep on this kind of local change support for districts. And within that really saw the value of the CS Vision framework as really an important starting point for district leaders, or even teachers or instructional coaches, principals that might not have any orientation towards CS or very limited knowledge of CS, but are experts in their students, are experts in their communities, are experts in their needs, and have always thought about the purpose of education. And so the idea of starting with their values around the purpose of education and then bridging that in to a set of activities that we've now developed over the course of a number of years that support deliberation around what are even possible purposes of computer science education? What are ways you might think about it? And where does that maybe align with what you already care about? that was really a critical place to start with districts. So now the visions framework is an associated activity. So one of the first things we do with districts in our what we call our script workshops, which are strategic planning workshops around CS education. And I think it also aligns philosophically with how CSforALL thinks about processes of educational change and how it thinks about really the CSforALL movement as not being something that is telling people what to do, but rather supporting communities in their own agency and in their own desires to figure out what they want their relationship to CS education to be, how they want to fashion CS education in their own image and towards their own needs and aspirations. And so the visions, framework, and activities really allow us as an organization at CSforALL to express our values around not telling people what to do, supporting districts to do what they think is important.
Yeah, and I believe I went through some of those activities at the CSforALL event in El Paso about a year ago.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. It led to some really good conversations among the table, like the people who were talking about how they had different values and impact areas and why. And it was interesting to go through. So I could see a district going through scripts being a very valuable thing when it's aligned with stuff like this. Like these activities would be wonderful. One of the things that you had both mentioned, I believe, if I remember correctly, in the relatively recent webinar, was that you like to focus on equity and social justice. And I know CSforALL does as well, but for both of you as CS educators and scholars, what do you wish other CS educators understood better about social justice within, through, and around computer science education?
I think one core piece is that, when we wrote the most recent white paper, in our author's note, we made our own values really transparent. And like you said, social justice and using computing as a vehicle to support students in making change in the world and in being critical about technology, that's a core part of what we believe CS education is for. And lots of others believe similarly. And so in supporting folks who want to integrate social justice education with CS, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think that's the first point I would make. So many amazing social justice minded educators have already thought about great principles for this work. So culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, which is Paris and Aleem, Gloria Ladson Billings, Geneva Gay. There's some real incredible thinkers who've been doing this for a while. Louis Moll and Funds of Knowledge. There's a lot that you can read and learn about. So there are all these efforts to integrate and to support social justice pedagogy within education at large. And the goal would be to think about, what does that look like in a CS context? A lot of those efforts fundamentally say the same thing: get to know your communities, get to know your students' experiences and their ways of knowing and their aspirations. So a lot of it feels at this point even commonsensical, but bears repeating over and over because it often just doesn't happen. There are tons of ways to draw on the knowledge of organizations like in New York City, we have the New York Coalition of Radical Educators, or the Connected Learning Community, and the Hive Learning Network, where there are all these youth development organizations who've been doing this work for a long time. So I would say, don't reinvent the wheel. Look for these wonderful examples, and then forge strong partnerships with communities to really understand their values and their purposes for CS Ed would be a great start. Because the worst thing that could happen is people coming in with their own notions of what social justice is and imposing that on others. Social justice is about building from the grassroots, listening to people, and then working in solidarity to fight for change and ensure a more just society.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think one of the big messages I would have around values of equity and justice within CS education is that we've made really great strides in certain parts of the equity conversation. In particular, just the idea of CSforALL in and of itself is very powerful, right? It's the idea of a kind of universal access to something that we see as a good. And then, in particular, how thoughtful the conversation about broadening participation has been. About it's not just for all, but we need to say, part of that, implicit in that, and we need to elevate within that, this idea that there are particular groups that have been historically marginalized, historically excluded, African American students, young women, especially young women of color, students with disabilities, rural students. There's all sorts of groups that have really been excluded and not given access. We need to think carefully about those. We've made huge strides, and obviously we're not done with that work, but those are established as, I think, values. What is not yet established as values is, one, what Sara just said, and I think what we're trying to partly argue for in this white paper, that equity is not just in outcomes, but in process. Mm-hmm. It's about who's at the table. And if you just impose from above, yes, all kids must, and then you don't involve anybody from a community, any students, any teachers, like, first of all, good luck with implementation. But second of all, like, that's really not equitable. That's really, it's kind of authoritarian. That's not how we want educational change to look. Even if it has some idea of equity as an outcome for students, the process really matters. So that's one way. And I think that we do see, and I think very smart, especially smart districts and smart out-of-school organizations that are really thoughtful and dedicated, really do, I think, approach in these ways, really do think, in New York, they really did an amazing community engagement process with teachers, principals, out-of-school organizations, industry, to think about, like, well, what do we want this to be? And I was really excited to be able to participate in that, and kudos to the New York City DOE for the way they did that. I think the other big area of equity in CS that's underexplored right now is how issues of equity really play directly into the curriculum itself, right? You can think about equity in access to CS, but what is the CS you're giving access to? If it's just loops and variables, or even, amazing creative computing, there's lots of things that you're not addressing that are actually equity issues within CS that are critical. In the K-12 CS framework, there are 5 big concept areas. One of them is the social impacts of computing. And if I want to look for a curricula that teaches about loops and variables, then I've got a million options. And if I want curricula to teach about the social impacts of computing, my field narrows practically to 0. Yep. Right? There's very, very little out there. And those are the places where we can talk about things like algorithmic bias, things like, the culture of computing and how it might exclude certain groups, and how we might think about changing and having those discussions with our students. It's a place that we can think about emerging issues of privacy and surveillance in society. It's the place where we can talk with students about what is the role of technology in democracy and public discourse, disinformation. And these are things that I think kids are really interested in too, right? I think that kids can really get into this. It also, from an implementation standpoint, means that you're not relying on teachers having to have all of this knowledge around very, say, quote unquote, deep. I would say this is a different form of deep, but what we might classically think of as, like, well, I know 5 programming languages and now I can teach computer science. Every teacher in the world is like going to be like, holy cow, I'm running the other direction. But you talk to a social studies teacher about doing a unit on how to think about, the social impacts of computing in World War II. And wow, their eyes are going to light up, right? Yep. You have a whole different way in. And from an implementation standpoint, that means that you're also able to have that many more educators that are going to be part of this process. And so I think like that, those really 2 big points of equity in process and equity in the kind of as represented in the ideas that you teach about are 2 big things we need to elevate to to go beyond, but not leave behind at all, the discourse around access and the discourse around broadening participation, both of which are absolutely critical, but we can't stop there, right? We need to extend those into further conceptions of what good, equitable, and justice-oriented CS education can look like.
Yeah, I think that builds off of a podcast that released very recently, at least at the time of recording, with Sarah Judd. She was talking about a lot of that stuff related to AI and education and the curriculum that she's developing. And then Sara, what you mentioned several times in this podcast, I've highly recommended to people, read outside of the field. Like, you need to be reading from other people. Don't just keep going down this same rabbit hole, because there's a lot of people who have already talked about these things in other subject areas that are very applicable to what we're doing in CS education.
Definitely. There's great work on culturally responsive computing. Like, I know Kimberly Scott, Ron Eglash, there are a lot of folks who have been applying ideas from Gloria Ladson-Billings' work to computing, and the sort of like those intersections are going to become really important.
So I'm curious, what questions have I not asked that you would like to discuss related to the framework or anything else?
Rafi and I have been thinking a lot about curricular integration recently. Like, when you think about all these different impacts and values underlying computing education that we talk about in the framework. Another one that is burgeoning and people are trying to really put a lot of attention to is the sense of how do we use computing in the school disciplines. And so that's something that maybe if not, we can't get into in depth in this podcast, deserves a whole other one. Because there's so many issues about how do we get social studies teachers excited and how are these disciplines fundamentally changing? Now there's digital humanities. There are so many fields that students don't get exposure to in their K-12 lives that involve using the tools of computing to do work in the disciplines.
Yeah, that's an interesting area of discussion. One of the things that I have recommended for districts who are interested in integration is to not just start with CS as integrated, but to start with CS or coding as its own thing, and then integrating after the kids and some of the teachers have had experience with it. Because it's really hard if we think of it from the TPACK framework, the technological knowledge, the pedagogical knowledge, and the content knowledge. If you're going to ask a bunch of teachers to not only teach their subject area, but to also learn the technology, which would be the coding platform, the pedagogy involved with how to teach CS education or coding, and then the content knowledge involved with that, and how they intersect with other disciplines, it's really hard to do. But it'd be a lot easier if okay, in your coding class, you learned how to do this thing. Now we're going to take those concepts and apply it to this subject area. How can you take what you've learned in Scratch to make a social studies project, etc.?
Yeah, it takes collaboration and I think that it sort of starts to unveil and reveal all of the structural barriers to incorporating CS education into a school day. That's why I love curricular integration. It's such a puzzle. All of a sudden you realize, oh wait, teachers are in these disciplinary silos. They don't work together across disciplines. When are we going to have enough time in the school day to fit in all of these, to do this rich multidisciplinary work?
Yeah, and I think that speaks to something that, I think we can tease, but it's almost like its entire own subject. I think one of the really big questions that we have so much work to do on as a field is ultimately this question of how do we translate our values into practice, right? So really when it comes down to it, and this is work that, I've been doing research on, studying school district change over the course of years, longitudinal studies of school districts, and really trying to see how do they go from, say, the process of doing a visions deliberation activity where they talk about we care about creativity and we care about, social mobility and tech jobs, and to actually translate that into the kind of systems change. And when and how are they able to adhere to their values? When do they encounter barriers? Because so much of this work is about the complexity, really working within and trying to transform the existing ways that schools as institutions and districts as organizations are structured. And I think that's, what Sara was just talking about well, actually, do teachers across disciplines have time to collaborate together? Heck, do teachers within disciplines have time to collaborate together? No. Right? I mean, so I mean, I think that, I would hope that as we go about this work, we can both root these questions of how we translate values into system change as questions that we ask together as a field and really think about together, so that we're not just only thinking about kind of CS learning on a short time scale and within the kind of context of a curriculum or a classroom or a set of students, but really thinking about what does it actually really mean to undergo the kind of institutional transformation that are required to actually enact our values in this. And I think that there's more people who are doing this, but we really need everyone who's doing this work to be sharing those lessons back, not just, hey, I've got this great unit, but I want to actually know how the heck did that unit come to be if you're working within a school district and teachers worked on it? How did they even get there? How did they get enough knowledge to make it? And then what have you found out as you've tried to actually implement it over time or implement it at scale? Those are really critical questions.
Absolutely.
As I mentioned before at the start of recording, I'm really interested in the multi, inter, and transdisciplinary spaces and whatnot and engagement. But we can't even really get there yet if we still have certification issues in that, well, what does it mean to be a CS educator in a state where there's no certification? and there's no background in that. And how do you develop that professional knowledge and understanding and get qualified people in the room to do that? And then how do you get them to help others with integration? Like, there's all these things we have to get through before we can like really start diving deep into the integration stuff.
A lot of it, I think, is like all the levers that have to get pulled at once. Like, you need strong classroom examples to show people who train teachers or who prepare teachers to show that this is valid in a classroom. You need people who prepare teachers in order to, it's a cycle. You need all of like standards and policy and teacher prep and leadership. Like, everything has to be pulled at the same time in small ways in order to answer any of these questions.
Yeah. And I'm happy. I think at some point, I think we now are starting to see some models of how districts go about the process of change over time to see like how do you pull different levers at what point, what's based on your particulars of, you know, the political situation in your district, the existing resources in your district, the existing knowledge of your team, the fact that you even have a team and you have routines around it, you know, all of those, you know, there's so many lessons that we're now starting to see around how do you even get started, right? How do you even get started as a district? And I think hopefully we'll have good things coming out and resources to support that process. I think the visions deliberation tools are part of that. The script rubric is another part of that. And certainly being connected to national communities and information sources like this podcast are really amazing, you know, all going to kind of play into that question of how you get started.
So where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
All of the resources, including a online fun little quiz, an unplugged visions activity, our visions white paper, can all be found at visions.csforall.org. That's CSFOR all.org, not the number. And I'm at Empathetics on Twitter. You can always reach out to me there. If you are not a member of CS4All, you can also become a member. Whole districts can become members, content providers can become members, individual researchers can become members, funders can become members. And if you do become a member, then you get added to CS4All Slack community, and then you can reach out directly to so many folks within that network directly. You know, this is a community-based effort. We're not going to get to this going alone, and so definitely join and connect with, you know, so many great colleagues in this space.
The website for the NSF project that I work with, which is participating in literacies and computer science. Right now, the website's just a landing page, pila-cs.org. But soon we're going to have lots of resources up there about supporting bilingual students in computer science education. So you can stay tuned, pila-cs.org. And then I can just be found at Sara E. Vogel on Twitter, SaraEVogel.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Rafi and Sara. I know I certainly did. Again, you can find the show notes with all the links to the various scholars and publications that were mentioned just by clicking in the link in the description or visiting jaredoleary.com. If you haven't done so yet, I hope you consider sharing this with somebody else, as it would mean a lot to me. And it would help spread the word about scholarship and ideas related to CS education. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you listen again next week to another Unpacking Scholarship episode.